Hi and welcome back. Today we're going to look at the tape delay plugin. Found in the insert menu, it's in the delay section at the bottom, tape delay. Most time-based effects like this and reverb and delay designer and those types of plugins where the signal is processed over time are usually used on buses or auxes. You put it on a bus and then you send your signal to it via a send. Or alternatively, you can use it directly on a channel strip insert, as I'm doing in this case for illustrative purposes. But either way is acceptable, but the more common way is to use it on a bus. So in this case, the dry and wet mix signal is going to be controlled from here, whereas when it's on a bus, you would normally have the dry signal all the way down, wet signal all the way up, and then send via one of the sends on your channel. But for today, as a direct channel strip insert, we're going to control the mix there. All right, let's start briefly by looking at the parameters on the tape delay plugin, and then we'll get into using them in a musical way. So this is basically a delay plugin. On the left here, you have the feedback parameter. This is how many iterations of the delay are going to be generated by the plugin. You have to be careful when you have it up too high, it's going to generate repeats ad infinitum. I'll demonstrate it in a moment, and it accumulates and gets louder and distorts. So you got to be careful with that level and that parameter. It's a fairly delicate setting. You have your delay time here where you can set the delay in milliseconds, or you can sync it to tempo when the sync button is in. Right now my song tempo is at 120, so the tempo there is 120. When you enter a value in here, the sync button will go off, or you sync it to tempo. When it's synced to tempo, you can use these little musical notes for rhythmic delays that are preset. You have a half note, quarter note, eighth note, 16th note, so it'll set the delay to the amount of milliseconds necessary to sync up with those rhythmic divisions at the tempo of your song. And there's a groove slider here, which allows you to offset the amount of swing on every second note. And this is interesting. We're going to look at it in a moment. When you put it all the way up to 75%, you can get musical delayed values of dotted rhythms. So, for example, that'll be like a dotted eighth note amount of delay rather than a regular eighth note. And when you lower it, the second one is behind the beat and slower. And when you go all the way down to 33.3, right around there somewhere, you'll get like a triplet kind of feel, good for a 12/8 or 6/8 thing. But when you default it to 50%, there's no swing added to put it ahead or behind of the beat for the second notes. Tape delay also offers some filtering, which can be very useful, musical, and fun. You have a low cut and a high cut filter so that you can set what range of the frequency of the delays that are generated are going to be filtered. And this works interestingly in conjunction with the feedback parameter. The higher the feedback level, the more the filtering is applied to each successive delay. So you can get some interesting effects with that. Tape delay also offers some LFO functionality for some nice modulation and chorus type of effect. There are two parameters, LFO rate, which is adjusted here, and LFO depth to the right of it. Basically, when you have the depth off, there's no effect. But adding some depth and rate will give it a nice chorus effect. We have flutter rate and intensity, meant to simulate the effects of tape, old tape saturation, when tape gets warbly, wow, and flutter and that kind of thing. You can play with these to get some interesting effect. We have the dry and wet mix sliders, as I discussed at the beginning, used to balance the dry and wet mix signal together. And there's one extended parameter here, which is interesting, distortion level. You can set this, and this is relevant particularly when you're using a lot of feedback and the signal can clip and overload easily. This will give you a sort of different type of distortion type of sound. I'll demonstrate it momentarily. All right, let's see what this puppy can do in action. I'm going to mute it for a moment, bypass it rather, and play you a little drum groove that I have programmed up. Very simple. So let's start by playing with some of these parameters. I'm going to start by syncing it to tempo and giving it a little eighth note delay. I'm just going to leave the parameters as is. I've been twiddling them and dialing them around while we've been demonstrating the parameters, but let's see what it sounds like just like this. So you hear a little subtle extra delay that's being added on. I'll play you just the wet signal so you can filter it here. Let's put up the feedback. You hear as the feedbacks keep getting generated, it gets thinner and thinner. It's because this keeps getting applied to each successive delay generated by the feedback. Let's mix that in. Or alternatively, we can have a very low type of effect. Now watch what happens if I put the feedback up too high. See the quality of the distortion? So let's leave that nice and low. And less feedback. Now, let's demonstrate the groove parameter here. Watch what happens. I'm going to put it up all the way to 75. Right now we're hearing a straight eighth note delay. You're going to hear a dotted eighth effect. Interesting, eh? On a fast tempo like this, even a longer one will work nicely. It'll be like a dotted quarter now. And it's like a dotted half. I'm going to go with the dotted eighth for now. Just a little bit of wet signal. All right, let's see what the LFO does now. I'm going to put the wet up just so we can hear the wet in isolation now, and we'll hear the effects of the LFO. Hear the modulation? It's a little too much, maybe less depth. That's an interesting effect. Just tweaking my parameters here. I don't personally like the LFO on this, but to give you an idea of what it does. And the flutter. Seems like an old tape that's sort of warped and warbling. Wound flutter. I'll leave it on a bit for effect. And the smoothing just balances out these effects and sort of rounds them off and gets them to blend in a bit better. So there we've got a nice funky little pattern going with the tape delay using the sync to tempo effect, adding in a dotted value by putting this up to 75%, doing a bit of filtering, putting in some feedback so that we have multiple iterations of the delay being generated. When this is all the way down at 0, by the way, you get one instance of the repeat. Let's listen to just the wet signal. So it's basically the regular groove just offset because we're only getting one repeat. But in practice, though, it's interesting playing with a bit of feedback. You want multiple delays generated. And also, I forgot to mention the freeze button. This is interesting. What it does is when you press it, this is an interesting parameter to automate. The moment you press the button, whatever repeat is happening at that moment, it'll capture it and keep repeating it. Yeah, let me illustrate it with just the wet signal. So you can get some nice interesting effects with that. Interesting on vocals too. I have some vocals set up on another track, and we're going to take a look and see how we can use that in a different way. So let me call up the inspector. I'm going to unmute that, and I'm going to call up the tape delay, another instance of it. And first thing I'm going to do is just bypass it, and I'll play you the vocals on their own.
Everybody on the dance floor. Dance, 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 dance.
So just some straight ahead vocals. Let me solo them, and I'll loop it. Let's see what we can do now with tape delay. So I'm going to take that off bypass, and I'm going to turn off sync mode and type in a really quick delay, let's say 40 milliseconds. So this is good for generating a doubling kind of effect, to get a doubled vocal sound.
Everybody on the dance floor.
I'll put up the wet signal so you can hear it.
Everybody on the dance floor.
Do a little less feedback.
Everybody on the dance floor.
Without it.
Everybody on the dance floor.
With it.
Everybody
So you can generate some nice, tight doubling effects like that. You can put a slightly higher amount, let's say 100 milliseconds, and we'll get kind of a slapback type of effect.
Everybody on the dance floor. Everybody on the.
And again, when this is all the way off, we're getting one repeat.
Everybody on the dance floor.
That's a tight slapback.
Everybody on the dance floor.
A little less wet.
Everybody on the dance floor.
It's one way of using it, or with some feedback.
Everybody on the dance floor.
So, interesting effects either way.
Everybody on the dance floor. Everybody on the dance floor.
Like an old bad spring reverb. Yep, you can do it all, ladies and gentlemen. This is a Swiss Army knife. So those are some interesting ways of using the tight delays on vocals to get some doubled or slapback type of effects. Or we can fall back on good old-fashioned sync. So let's try putting this up to the same kind of dotted value of dotted eighths. Put the feedback down a bit and the wet up.
Everybody on the dance floor.
That'll work. So let's end off this video by listening to our drums and vocals together with dotted eighth sync mode.
Everybody on the dance floor. Dance, 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 dance. Everybody on the dance floor. Let's dance.
Let's freeze that last one.
Let's dance.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Tape delay, lots of fun parameters to play with here. Nice tempo synced rhythmic subdivisions or tight delays for doubling and slapback effects. Some wound flutter to get some old tape effects and some modulation to get some depth and chorus. And you can control the distortion level if you're going to do a lot of feedbacks and or high feedback value with a lot of delays rather. So lots of fun, lots of parameters to play with. Enjoy it, experiment, don't hurt yourself, and I'll see you next time for more.